going through my email, we did chat in 2015, but it wasn't for your music. It was for Silver Lake Chorus.
Oh, cool. I didn't realize that. Awesome.
So I interviewed you and I went back. I used to work for 6 Degrees Records doing all of their press
Oh.
releases and bios. And so I found our clips when we talked in 2015. So it's a nice to have a 5-year catch up now. Much
Yeah,
different.
that was a great project.
That was
Yeah.
really fun.
Yeah.
I've been friends with Bob Duskus for 20 years now, and I've followed everything they've ever produced. And that was one of the more unique projects, and it
Yeah.
really came to light because of you. So that was a really good. I don't know if they're still together. That's the only thing I remember by them.
They are, and they're trying. The thing is, like, you know, when you have people doing something part-time and there's 25 of them, it's just the scheduling, like doing gigs together and making an album. That album took us 3 years or something because of the logistics of making, and then you bring in all these like rock stars and songwriters, and it was kind of nuts. But I do have that side of me that looks for the most interesting and difficult challenge in the room and then goes, let's see if we can figure it out. And it's almost like the more behemoth the sort of imaginative skill required in conceptualizing it, the more excited I get. So I
Yeah.
like those challenges.
No, I remember when I lived in New York City, I DJ'd with Antibalas a few times, opening for them, and that's a 17-member band, and I remember just talking to them about trying to tour with 17 people and how nuts that is. But you've been lifelong music, and before we get into the more conspirituality stuff, because I think this is also an important topic, and since we have you here, I know you recently recorded a video for sort of a little fundraiser for the Bootleg Theater, and with so many venues closing right now, as an artist who has spent your entire life performing, how do you feel about this moment musically, both in terms of what is coming out creatively, perhaps, or what you've been working on, but also about some speculation about the future of live music and what you think we can do with the circumstances?
Well, the marginalization of musicians in terms of the value that we feel they deserve for their content in our society that's been a steady decline for a number of years now, in the sense that, like, I just don't think the average person believes or values music as a commodity in the way they might have in the 70s or 80s. So, like, a lot of young people, music is something that's consumed through TikTok or through video games, but it's basically like it's a like peripheral consumption of music, as opposed to like the old audiophile thing where you get the new album and put it on headphones and listen to it over and over and memorize the lyrics. And so from that perspective, what we've continued to see through COVID, the lack of concern, essentially, by our wider society for what's happening to artists, doesn't seem that surprising. We're headed back to Australia in December at least for 2021. And partly that's because I'm going to be able to work there. And I know so many musicians who, they just haven't been able to work. And I don't know what's going to happen to, like, creatively. Do you then I think you sort of get this, sort of spread where you get either people that are already relatively privileged and can continue to make their work without worrying about live performance and royalties and that sort of thing, or you get the Dostoevskys of the world who, like, the chaos of it spurs them into more creativity, and they sit in the madness with no money and unable to pay their rent, and they create their, like, genius statements on on humanity. So I think those two types of artists are sort of the ones who are continuing to be very dynamic and prolific. But for the majority of artists who are like working artists, it's a very hard time to be able to continue.
How have you found that it's affected your own creativity?
I've gone through phases. I think I'm someone who, it's quite funny, like in the beginning of quarantine and everything, when everyone was like, this is the chance to like make your masterpiece and write your novel and all of that. I thought that's actually good advice for people that have already built those skills, but you're not suddenly going to get the ability to conceptualize and manifest work um, in such chaos without having built those muscles. And I'm someone who, I go from project to project. So for me, rolling this atmosphere into that felt easier. But I have other friends who have been completely creatively paralyzed. I think at the moment, honestly, at the moment, all I can think about is the election. And I'm putting all of my creativity into encouraging people that voted third party or didn't vote in the last election to vote and vote blue. And that's where I'm putting my creativity. I'm halfway through making an album, but I've put it all on hold for the moment because I just can't justify putting energy into anything other than this very important cause right now.
I was reading an article this morning about the idea that influencers can no longer remain politically neutral. And realistically, I mean, that's a debate we can have, but a longstanding argument I've heard is that entertainers should not be political. And you'll see sometimes someone will come out and then people will be like, just play your music or just act, don't talk. And this whole idea, which I've always found completely nuts because everyone is a citizen and has a voice, but you have definitely been very vocal. And has that something have you always felt it important to speak out politically, or have you felt that it's ramped up over 2020?
Yeah, I mean, I've always felt it important to speak up about what I was passionate about. That historically hasn't been politics, with the exception of there's been movements that I felt very connected with or inspired by, but they were sort of these periodic things that I would get, feel like I wanted to speak up and share my voice in. But I don't know, at the moment, it's funny, like being an immigrant to America, I moved here when I was 18. So that's 24 years ago. Sometimes you find immigrants are more patriotic than people that were born in a certain country because we had to choose to come. And in some ways, perhaps naively, I kind of still like believe in America in like a fundamental sense of what it could be. I mean, I remember at 12 years old coming with my parents, and I was a huge Spike Lee fan. And all I wanted to do in LA was go to the 40 Acres and a Mule store and buy Spike Lee merchandise. Because to me, like from Australia, just wait for that sound, maybe. Playing overhead.
Oh, I can't hear it.
Oh, okay, good. For me, coming from Australia, I viewed the America as a container that could tolerate intense dialogue about race and art and revolution, to be have the potential for just like healing and radical change and just this amazing momentum. And I've got to say that optimism has it's been worn down in me over the years, because I kind of thought there were more people like me than the other way that actually wanted things to maintain the status quo or go backwards. But for me, there was obviously all of Trump's presidency, I've been incredibly disheartened, but there was a moment, and it was connected to Black Lives Matter. I found that the emergence of that movement to be so emotional and inspiring for me. And I know the conversations that I was having with Black friends and with white friends within my family, we were having new conversations. There was actually something happening that firstly, the complete lack of support for that dialogue from the current administration I found to be criminal, let alone sending the military in to quell protesters and to share the message that essentially dissent is unpatriotic. I mean, I found it all so disturbing. And then moving into the QAnon thing, where not only was there a disregard for Black Lives Matter, but actively there was, this counter argument that it was whatever they call it, a psyop, or that it was somehow a distraction from the real issues, I found so personally insulting. And I think that was the moment when it sort of became like inconceivable for me to stand on the sidelines of this conversation. I felt drawn into it in such an emotional way and with such sort of like veracity and like belief in my understanding of the authenticity of this conversation that we need to be having. It was just undeniable to me. And so all of this kind of got me more and more pumped up. And I was just like, I am going to do my part to get this guy out of office.
Yeah, I've noticed some pushback on your feed, but not a lot. It's mostly overwhelming support, which is great. But obviously there's trolls, there's operatives, and there's just people who don't agree, which is fine. There is room, I've found online, for some critique and debate that remains civil, but obviously most of the time it's not. And when you read about people pushing back on you, how do you feel and how do you respond to that?
I've always had a kind of mixed reaction to criticism. There's a part of me that, like everybody, I want to be heard, I want to be understood, I want to connect. But there's also like a punk rocker in me that is, I come from underground music. I come from the idea that pushing buttons is good, and that art and that speaking the truth and poetry and, ideas are not meant to be, you're not meant to receive total, just, unfettered support from who you're talking to. That some pushback is healthy, but that doesn't mean that I need to engage with it. I generally take I think you're in a different world in that you're, with this podcast and everything, this project is really about creating conversation. I'm an individual, and my platform is not a democracy, and I'm not interested in giving space. I'll often there'll be one attempt at engagement if I think the person's sincere. But if they use a hashtag like Trump 2020 or something, it's done right away. Because as soon as you use a hashtag, you're basically drawing other people with like minds on social media, drawing their attention to the post. And that, I feel, is an aggressive act. And I block and delete all of those types of people.
I've noticed that the second amount of listeners to the podcast are actually from Australia. And I
Oh,
also
really?
have a music project called Earthrise Sound System, and we've been around for 10 years. We do it occasionally, but interestingly, the second number of listeners we have is from Australia. And our first record was called The Yoga Session. So it's beat driven, but it's made for that community. And so I've always had some relationship and to the wellness community. Obviously there's something in Australia. I know you lived in the US for a long time, but you do go back, and I'm wondering, what are the parallels that you found between we use the term wellness community, obviously that's a big term, but between what you experience in the States and what you see in Australia?
Yeah, I mean, Australia is it definitely has a large group of people that, we have, like, I don't know if you played like the Byron Bay Blues and Roots Festival, and there's a lot of hippies and, on the Central Coast, on the East Coast, and there's a big yoga, kirtan, that sort of world that I've always been sort of like peripherally involved in for different reasons. But I think one of the things that's interesting about Australia is our experience of racism is very different, because, Aboriginal people in Australia are more like the Native Americans in America, in that it's a little bit out of sight, out of mind. The genocide already happened. While we still make gestures of reconciliation, they really are gestures at this point. It's not the same as dealing with the relationships between Black and white Americans, who this is an active dynamic, massive population within America. So in some ways, the racism within Australia, or even if it's like more covert and it's just obliviousness to the reality of racism, is like, it's very conceptual. It's very conceptual. You know, I had never really, I mean, one of the things I really credit your podcast with is helping me and a lot of people I know think about the inherent privilege that's based in sort of new age communities,
Yeah.
and how a lot of the people who kind of drop out of, you know, going to law school on their parents' dime and everything, and then get into like macrobiotic foods and move and open a yoga center and all that, that is an incredibly privileged position to be in. And I think the new age world in Australia is quite privileged and is protected in that way from some of the realities of what just what needs to be discussed, you know, at a social level.
Yeah, that's something. Part of the reason I know I have the analytics tracking, but I also, a lot of people from Australia reach out to us. The number one is always Pete Evans that they're pointing out.
Yeah.
But there are a number of yoga instructors who are kind of towing this line. And even though we do have what you said, that conflict, or it's more in your face in America, I would imagine, than Australia in terms of racial dynamics, it's still easy to fall into pockets, even here in Los Angeles. In New York City, on the subway, I would hear 10 languages every time I got on. In Los Angeles, you have to drive to different areas to experience different cultures, so it's a little bit different. And have you noticed with the QAnon, I don't know how much in touch you are. You said you had some family in Australia, so maybe some. Have you seen a proliferation of QAnon to the degree that you've seen it here in Australia?
Yeah, I actually have, and it's concerned me. So for your, you know, I guess part of this conversation in terms of my involvement in sort of fighting QAnon and their disinformation that, you know, your listeners for the most part, and even a lot of my fans don't know about me, is my kind of journey as a, you know, quote unquote spiritual seeker over the years has taken me through a lot of different worlds. You know, I was born Jewish, but I always had this kind of just, you know, thirst for knowledge that I'm sure we all did, and I was like, I want to find out the truth. I want to experience different viewpoints. I want to tap into the occult wisdom of the ages, and, you know, all these kind of things. I can now look back on those experiences, go, oh, that's called moving through different cults. In fact, I've sort of come to the belief that there is no way for spiritual knowledge, and again in quotes, to be taught or shared in a group without it being a cult. My feeling is that all of that real inner knowing is an incredibly personal experience. And as soon as there's any type of group dynamic, it's naturally going to be like a cult dynamic. It's just in its nature. So as I've moved through these different explorations, and that's the thing, like when I tell people, oh yeah, I've been in cults, they imagine I like moved onto some sort of homestead and, you know, I don't know, had, you know, 9 wives and whatever I was doing. But for me, it was more like, I think these, I was in a Qigong, I studied Qigong at a place called the American Taoist Healing Center in New York, that for a number of years that I view as having, you know, kind of cult-like qualities. When my wife and I actually got married by a Hindu guru called Narayani Amma, who's like a male manifestation of the divine mother energy that was a cult. And then I studied I studied this thing called the Numa system with this teacher called Juan Ruiz Nalpari, that was a mixture between like Gnostic Christianity and ayahuasca work and Peruvian, you know, all this kind of occult sort of weirdness, you know. And then even through that, I got involved with doTERRA and essential oils. And so I've had an experience of that whole thing. And what's interesting about that is the ongoing debate of, are MLMs cult-like? I feel like the QAnon thing it's the nail in the coffin. All we have to look at is how many people from that world have bought into QAnon. And it highlights that the the perception of that world being cult-like was like completely accurate, and that those people involved in that are prone to that type of thinking. Take out even the economic side of it, and that So anyway, all of that's background knowledge on why I have quite a broad connection to people in these different worlds, and with each of them, I came to different moments of realizing I was in a cult with cult-like behavior. But I hadn't yet it hadn't cohesively formed in my mind as like, it's almost like the QAnon thing has allowed me to see it clearly because I'm so diametrically opposed to its values. And I'm watching people drop like flies around me in Australia and in America. And I'm going like, oh, this is what it feels like when you choose not to get on the bus and just go in the direction that it's going. But it's given me sort of amongst my community kind of a unique skill set in being able to, I'm also good mates with, Bonnie and Mark, who were in that show, The Vow, who were in Nexium. So I've been involved in these conversations, over the last decade. And it's like, now what I'm seeing is like, it's this mix. It's probably much like what you're feeling. It's both the inevitability of this experience, that the seed was planted for this type of thinking and for these type of people to get involved in fascism long ago, and we were all directly involved in it. Like, we all helped cultivate this atmosphere. I love that piece that it's Julian, right? The other guy in the podcast. Julian did that little piece on Instagram about the complex implications of being told to trust your intuition and your heart over logic. And that's a lesson that I was directly involved in disseminating and sharing and telling people as I was like gaslighting them so I could continue to gaslight myself and stay involved in all these various different programs. So I do feel a sense of like personal responsibility in terms of the contribution. It's almost like, I think when like Limp Bizkit came out after the Beastie Boys, and you go, the Beastie Boys had to honestly look at themselves and go, look, we didn't want it to end up here, but we can't deny that our behavior helped lay the track for this. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I actually, that just brings up a memory. I was in the college organization at Rutgers when I was there, and we had Biohazard and House of Pain headline, and there was this little band that hadn't had an album yet called Korn that opened. And I ended up, I don't know if you know Korn, but basically of the Limp Bizkit variety. But that just, yeah, that was an interesting moment in time.
Yeah, and it's like, this is what happens. Like, ideas come that have some sort of like, they could go either way depending how they're used. Like an idea like trust your intuition above science or logic, that idea could sort of be used for good at times if the logic you were being faced with was, for instance, like the logic of the tribe in organized religion, when they're telling you, oh no, don't read that book, don't do, and you're like, my intuition's it's like Kermit the Frog, like the Rainbow Connection, like my intuition's telling me to leave the tribe and to experience what's out there. But it can also be used, as we're seeing now, to become a total distrust of logic. And, so it's like, we are living in the result of too many people turning away from logic.
Yeah. Well, logic is, I mean, people have to remember that logic is a skill that you have to study for. Intuition is an evolutionary skill that we developed over time, and it's environmental. You learn certain patterns, and then you notice the glitches in the patterns. And that's really what intuition is. It's just your own personal training and then applied to different moments. So you're basing every new experience off of what you've experienced before. And if something seems a little bit off, then you get that feeling of like, wait a second, this feels weird to me. And this whole thing is disorienting. You brought up Nexium, which is a fantastic documentary. Watching the first one with my wife, we were both like, you know what, just watching the first episode, if we were around this sort of group 10 years ago, we might have been like, yeah, well, I'll check this out. This seems, there was nothing religious around
It
it
was a
at
little corporate
first.
for me. It was a little corporate for me. Like, I like the sexiness of like the psychedelic exoticism when I pick a cult. You know what I'm saying?
But I have a lot of friends who are lawyers, and
Yeah,
a number of them got into like Landmark Forum, for
right.
example, which is very that corporate, that same, they suit different temperaments, I guess you could say. I'm with you on the psychedelic side, but the idea of promoting clarity and focus and ways to excel in your career, those are all things that productivity, that's all things that people are looking for now. But then you watch how it slides down that rabbit hole of that show. But at least with Nexium, there was a very clear leader, and you might not yet, even it's not all out yet, so you don't yet know the totality of the intentions. I mean, you might because you're friends with them, but with QAnon, there is no leader. There's something completely different happening now. And I just would like to get your thoughts on what you think the real dangers of QAnon are.
Yeah. To me, the the dangers of cult-like thinking are that they encourage you to make allowances for things that you wouldn't when you're in your right grounded mind, right? So the example I keep coming back to is like, once the spiritual QAnon people went down this Trump is a light worker thing, right? Because they did this with gurus. There was always, like with Osho, there was the crazy wisdom, right? And
Yeah.
I experienced this, like, because I've been around gurus, and there is an incredible devaluation of one's personal experience that, oh, the guru said this to me. It didn't make sense, but obviously they were trying to tweak me and twist me and reveal things to me. What do you think it meant? And ultimately, there is a placing of the guru's agenda or behavior as far above one's own perception of what's right and wrong. And when we're living at a time when, for instance, like climate change and race relations, and I mean, they're two that jump to mind, but there are so many issues that need to be dealt with clarity, with tenderness, with compassion, with logic, with science. The biggest danger is that we're going to run out of time, that we're going to be so sidetracked
Yeah.
by trusting whatever Trump the light worker is doing, or whatever Q is saying, that we don't do what we're meant to be doing, which is getting our asses in gear and fixing these problems.
Yeah.
Because this is not an infinite runway we've got to deal with this stuff. And I'm just seeing this massive distraction. So I know other people are like focused on violence, and the potential threats of violence from QAnon and I'm there with that too. But the bigger issue for me is this distraction. And it's interesting, like, so yeah, we were talking about in Australia, how is QAnon manifesting? And I have a friend down there who's an essential oils person, Jessie Reimers, and she's quite like famous in that world. And she reached out to me after seeing my posts, and she was like, these people are driving me crazy. Like, there's people all through doTERRA who have lost it. And they're all aboard this, like, Trump is a light worker thing. And I said, well, look, I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I invite you, if you feel authentically about this, to make a statement, because I do think as many of us, there is power in numbers, and the more of us who simply say, not feeling it. It's literally like 1941, just like waving a hand going, not for me. Literally, the more of us that do that, because I actually think people that have already gone QAnon, you're not getting them back.
Yeah.
They've made their mind up. But there are people with one toe in and every day going in further. I feel like you guys, me, Sean Corn, all those, we can catch some of those guys. We can catch some of them and just be like, look, there's an alternative. That's not the only slope you can go down here. But I've seen, I've also been connected to, I know Mickey Willis. I've met Charles Eisenstein. I've done an event with JP Sears. Like, all of these people are in my broader community, and they are people who have, I am not someone who thinks a platform is a small thing. Look, if you're an Instagram influencer that just takes photos in bikinis, then maybe there is a limit to how seriously your ideas will be taken. But if you are someone that has built a platform based on your voice having resonance, I think the negligence associated with not tackling climate change, tackling racism, getting Trump out of office, I am absolutely shocked. And obviously these people we're mentioning have gone the other direction. And not only are they not dealing with it, they're actually promoting ideas that are counterproductive to us finding solutions. But I've just found it, it's bewildering. It's absolutely bewildering.
You mentioned
Sorry, I tend to get hopped up. I mean, I know everyone
oh,
does talking about this.
no, it's
Like,
great.
yeah.
We actually were on this online summit last night, the three of us, and there was like 20 some people on the call, and we started, and then there was Q&A, and it just turned into a free for all in a good way, because people are emotional right now and you need that.
Yeah.
But one thing that I love working with Matthew and Julian, they are infinitely more patient and compassionate than I am. I have a very short fuse at sometimes, especially with my bullshit detector. And it's a skill that I have to work on because sometimes I'm too upfront. But I wonder how you deal with this situation. So say you are engaging, and I think with the One Toen people, it is because there's still room for conversation and dialogue. And I've actually had a number of people reach out and request phone calls to talk these things through, which I've taken all of them because that's healthy. Because then you can actually look at someone and talk to them and have a real dialogue, which is something that's obviously missing. So how do you approach those situations? You mentioned a few people. I worked on with Mickey on something years ago. So these people are around, and I get it, but Mickey specifically has closed off communications with people that don't agree with him. I mean, he's admitted that online, so I'm not like revealing anything here. And so those people who are kind of hovering, how would you approach them and how do you talk to them?
Well, I think look, I've had people reach out to me and say, thank you. I was thinking I was the crazy one.
Yeah.
And the validation we received through speaking up and reflecting back at people, hey, you're not crazy. This is crazy. What's happening? That's huge. I just look for little opportunities. I mean, I bumped into the other day someone who you were on his podcast, Jeff, who does Commune, right? And I was, until he had you guys on, because I knew they'd had Charles Eisenstein on, and I was like a little concerned, like, which direction is this going to go? And I saw him and I thanked him for having you guys on. I said, thank you for that. I said, don't have Mickey Willis on your podcast. And I just said it to him, and he looked like flustered because he's obviously getting a lot of heat after having you guys on there. And he said, it's really been stressful. I want to get out of being involved in this whole conversation. I was like, that's fine, but no QAnon people on our platforms. We cannot do it. It is crucial that we call each other out on that. And a lot of there are these people like Mickey Willis who are relentless in their quest for being a leader and having their voice heard and being, having a lot of resonance at the time. But then there's a lot of people that just like have different platforms and go like, oh, let's be open-minded. Let's hear what this person, and they're not used to. I mean, this is the thing. It's like someone had said that the other day, you can be so open-minded, your brains fall out. But we sort of pride ourselves within this quote unquote conscious community of being open-minded. And it's really, I think, difficult for people to accept the idea that perhaps this isn't the time to be open-minded. And
Yeah.
I think that is a very challenging concept. I was like, because that was a 90s idea. Like that was like Nirvana, like Lollapalooza. Hey, let's just put every freak, let's give them a microphone, let's put them on a stage. I don't care how weird their ideas are. It's going to be great to have dialogue and everyone gets heard and people are smart enough to decide for themselves. Well, firstly, I'm not sure. I think it's proven that I'm not sure we are smart enough to decide for ourselves. Given all the information, I think we often gravitate to mistaken info. But also it's very difficult for liberal people to have boundaries in that way. And I think I've kind of co-opted the, Ringo Starr, Howard Stern, peace and love, peace and love. But with boundaries, you know what I mean? It's like, I'm sorry, this is not a moment where I am going to play any part in giving these types of arguments more airtime or more platform. And I'm encouraging everyone I come in contact with to do the same.
You mentioned earlier, I mean, we've been talking here and there and going in and out of spirituality. And I grew up without a religion. I have a degree in religion because I'm fascinated by it. But I've been an atheist for a long time. I'm more interested in storytelling. And that's moved me through as a journalist and as just someone who's around a lot of different circles. And specifically speaking of Judaism, my ex-wife is Jewish. My music partner is, my DJ partner, one of them was. I've been around that culture a lot. And one thing I've always appreciated about it is how open-minded everyone I know at least is, and the exploration of all these various spiritualities and how they fit into the pre-existing culture is so valuable. And so when you have something like QAnon, which has its roots in anti-Semitism, how does that make you feel personally?
It's complicated because, okay, take Israel as an example, which is a conversation that I think societally we're almost not quite ready to have yet. But there is a conversation to be had about the ties between Western capitalist governments and Israel. I don't think these are necessarily clearly black and white things, but there are conversations and we're not having them. And I think in a lot of ways that has created a breeding ground for anti-Semitism in a new way that because Jewish people have not necessarily been held accountable coming out of the Holocaust for some of the policies of Israel or whatever, that we should be able to talk about and just go, hey, I'm Jewish. I love the Jewish people. I want them to survive and thrive. Let's talk about what that really looks like in the most just way possible as a liberal, as a progressive. How do we do that? And we haven't been having those conversations. So I think in a lot of ways, that's echoing what I was saying before, that's the part where our side of the street has created the sort of fermentation of this type of anti-Semitism. All that being said, these arguments are so old, and the idea that there's Shylock pulling strings and, I mean, it's like, it's just, but the people who are falling for QAnon, they don't realize the anti-Semitic or the racist nature, the white supremacist roots of it. It's not, especially now. I was just listening to your last episode about the, because I was also following that last week, the dampening down of the message and the keywords and all of that. And we're going to see QAnon theories in a way becoming more mainstreamed and having the edge taken off them, much like we have yoga, the yoga community. It's like it has infiltrated the mainstream in ways that edgy ideas do. They kind of like, they have the edges taken off them, and it might become a little harder to spot the hidden agendas of white supremacy and anti-Semitism. But we need to continue to remember that being open to critique and being open to refinement, and that's another thing I love about what you guys are doing, that it does not imply that everything is okay in the world of big pharma or in the world of capitalism. It's like, these are problematic areas, and if we become just like staunch defenders of the system, we're not doing anyone any favors.
Yeah.
So I have complicated feelings about all of it, really.
Yeah, no, well, first off, I agree with you. I've learned long ago, coming from religion, from an academic and just a storytelling perspective, Theodore Herzl originally picked Uganda for the place the Jews to go, and then chose Israel, or that happened after his death, actually. But point being, like, when you hear the sacred land argument, you're like, well, you have to, but when you invoke that, you're immediately pushed into this category of anti-Semitism instead of actually having that discussion. And there's so many discussions that are difficult to have. So here's one I would like to entertain with how you act in your community and your friends with this. In the discussion last night in that summit, I brought up the fact that in 2017, I thought that there would just be a groundswell of people voting in Los Angeles. And it turns out that the election that put Garcetti in office, only 13% of Angelenos voted in that election. And that was a year after Trump. And I was just banging my head. I'm like, what's it going to take to get people to have civic participation? Because voting that's just the very first entry point into being a civilian. And I think part of the problem has been that talking of privilege, we've enjoyed the fruits of democracy without having to engage for so long. Now that we're being asked to, I think that has opened up avenues for conspiracy theories to creep in. So when you talk to, say you have some friends who aren't voters or think the whole system is rigged, so why even partake in it? How do you respond to them?
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I do have some friends who are disenfranchised, and friends of friends I hear about. I don't get as concerned about the ones in California because it is a blue state. But when you hear about, young Black creative people in Pennsylvania or in Florida feeling that what's the point, that does concern me. But I also take this is where my innate optimism comes in, that I have always liked that Buddha idea, it doesn't matter. I forget what it was. It doesn't matter how long you've been off the path. It's when you get started or whatever. And I do think that engagement, because for myself, political awareness has been a slow growth process. And I think that's okay. I have a stepdaughter who's 19 who, me and my wife have been very pro-Biden with a pragmatism of, this is about getting Trump out of office, guys. I could not care less what your ideals are at this moment, because we have a very real threat that needs to be neutralized. But I see how 19-year-olds think differently. And I try, in the same way artistically, I think when you're 19, you should be destroying structures. And when you're 42, like I am, you should be going, how do we work within the structures? And probably when you're in your 70s and 80s, you're like, how do we protect the structures? So I try not to be judgmental of that, because I understand it. I have empathy for it, but I try and kind of lead by example, in that I don't think there's anything corporate or weak or sellout about throwing your weight behind Biden right now. I think Joe Biden's brave. I think taking on this current moment in American politics requires immense courage. And the characterization of him as somewhat feeble or lacking chutzpah or something, I was like, dude, it's not possible. He could not be running this campaign right now if he wasn't full of moxie, And so I just kind of try and lead by example. I go let's make it cool. Let's go, hey, it's kind of like, who's going to stand up to the school bully? I don't care who they are, and I don't care what they did yesterday. If they're going to go up and stand up to the school bully, I'm with them. And that's kind of just my attitude I take with it.
Yeah, that's a good attitude. You mentioned climate change earlier, and I've been a columnist at Big Think for 8 years now. And one thing that I know, because again, seeing all the analytics of the columns, is I've talked about that column ever since I started writing there about that topic. And it doesn't perform well analytically. People just don't click on that. I can pretty much tell what stories are going to take off and which ones aren't at this point. And so we still cover the topic because it needs to be covered, but the engagement factor isn't there, when really that is going to decide everything, as we're learning in California right now. So what do you think it's going to take to get people to really care about that issue and inspire them to take action, so that we don't have to wait until 5 million acres are burned down in this state in order to understand that there's actually a problem happening right now?
Well, the conversation about language as a songwriter, it's really interesting because we're essentially talking about marketing and hooks in songs. Like,
Yeah.
why do certain song titles make you feel good about yourself? Like, singing them and singing along and walking around. Sorry, I'm just plugging my phone. Yeah, why are certain types of lyrical turns, are they hooky? Why are they memorable? And I was involved in an interesting conversation with a bunch of sort of different lefty activists recently about why isn't the word fascism doing it? Like, literally, when you look at what fascism is and who's it doing it for, it is motivating people 40 and up.
Yeah.
It is not motivating people under 40. And there's a conversation about language and certain words that have become so crude and so violent in our society, like the N word. That word has an emotional charge to it. If someone uses it, we feel in our bodies the violence and the danger that's present. Whereas if we say fascism, that isn't there yet for some reason. And similarly with climate change. Climate change does not, for some reason, has not captured the imagination of the masses to the degree that it needs to create the change that we're going to need to see. So what I really think that is about is more creative people, more out of the box thinkers, putting their heads together and buckling down and doing what we're doing now, which is discussing messaging and discussing how do we stop our world going off the deep end, whether it's on a local level or on a global level. We need more people involved in the conversation and more interesting ideas about how to talk about these things.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned you're an optimist, so let's end on what could be an optimistic outlook. We'll see. I don't know. I haven't asked it yet. But one thing that I've heard is that, okay, say Trump is voted out, hopefully, and he does actually leave, and we do have an administration, a new one, and we start to course correct. But of course, that 40% base isn't leaving. There are a number of QAnon candidates who are going to be in Congress, who are going to be taking these ideas forward. We are potentially dealing with a very frightening Supreme Court, which could have real world implications for tens of millions of people, if not the entire country, obviously. So let's take best case scenario where he is voted out. What does America look like in 2021, and how do we start to steer this ship in another direction?
I mean, obviously, I don't know, and I'm scared too. I think what I like to focus on is that what America needs more of is discernment. We grab for these headlines and these glamorous conspiracy theories or catchphrases, make America great again, because we don't have the courage or haven't had the courage to get into the weeds and be discerning with policy, with which representatives we're electing, with what ideas we're going to allow into the consciousness that we're sharing. And one of the things that I've been interested in with this QAnon, the mystics who are getting involved in QAnon, right? So the channelers and all of that, is I think what we're seeing, okay, let me go back a step. What I realized about my attraction to cult leaders is that I was seduced by power. That if I met a Qigong master who could do magical shit, like put a acupuncture needle in someone, then their arm would shake or whatever. I mean, all this stuff seems to happen. It seems to be just part of nature that we don't really understand. I would get seduced and go, this person has all the answers. If I met a guru who could sit perfectly for 12 hours and seem to know psychic things, whether it's like, whether that's manipulation or whether that's genuine, some kind of like intuitive power, I was seduced by that power. When I was in an ayahuasca ceremony and I would experience entities coming to me and telling me things, because they were non-physical, they existed within this imagination realm, I was seduced by their power and I gave their messages credit. And what I learned from reading about the Dalai Lama was, the Dalai Lama does lots of weird channeling, mediumship ceremonies where different Buddhas will enter different monks' bodies and the Dalai Lama will go to them for advice about different things. But he also disagrees with some of the spirits and he doesn't follow all their advice because ultimately he believes in the autonomy of his own experience and, takes it all in, but doesn't accept it blindly. And I realize personally, I have certainly erred in the being seduced by power. And I think America on the whole, and Australia too, but we've all been seduced by power. So you get these larger than life people and larger than life ideas that are sweeping us off our feet. And I think QAnon is that. I think QAnon is whoever Q or whatever Q is an entity. It's a conceptual idea that, I'm sure someone's just sitting typing up these things or whatever. But I don't like to discount the power of ideas and the seductive quality of them. Like I love I also love that QAnon Anonymous podcast. And I think they're so funny because they tease and there is immense value in that. And I do that too. I agitate QAnon by teasing them because I think that's another way of disempowering them. But I also like to recognize the power of these seductive tools. And some of these mediums, I don't know what mediums are. I don't know what they're doing. I tend to think, perhaps the naive side of me, I tend to think they're not making things up. I believe they genuinely think they are hearing voices and they are communicating with these concepts or whatever, but I would argue that the tool of discernment of saying, well, which voices do you want to follow? Which intuitive impulses are the ones that are going to lead you to liberation? And which ones are just going to bind you to Maya for many more lifetimes? That is a conversation within the spiritual community and within the wider social and political community that we need to be having about how seduced we are, how easily seduced we are into nonsense. And I think my optimism at this moment is in, I know I'm having this conversation with you today with much more transparency, honesty, and accountability than I would have a year ago regarding my past and my decisions and my involvement in different things. Because I see it as like the only way out of this is going to be being honest about the ways we've succumbed to these types of things before. And my hope is that will broaden. And just like Black Lives Matter has forced conversations into communities and into our homes, into our families, even though it's received pushback, it has forced those conversations in. I hope this battle with QAnon is doing the same thing, where within our wider communities and Trump in general, us really looking at ourselves and going, what's wrong with us? What is wrong with us? Something's obviously wrong with us, or we would not find ourselves in this situation. And it's very easy to point fingers externally and go, oh, it's because of them. It's because of them. They fell for Trump and they like the red hats and they are on meth or whatever it is, that, or they're uneducated or they're racist and all of that stuff. There's a truth to it too. But what's wrong with us? We are a community, a society that has allowed this to happen. And I think that conversation, I still believe it has the potential for healing. If we can ask it honestly and answer it honestly, I think good can come from it.